it challenges fundamentally the approach or assumptions that we as interpreters have about the text. Because, and what's interesting about the consensus on this passage is that because it's just presumed, no one really has many arguments against this position.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Isaac Soon, and we will be discussing an article that he wrote for the Journal of Biblical Literature, where he challenges a consensus that I think any of us who grew up going to Christian Sunday schools or Bible studies have been taught, which is that Zacchaeus was short. In the vein of things that are short, I will let Isaac explain what his article is saying. So please keep in mind, if you have any feedback, guest suggestions, or just unmitigated anger, send that my way at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Isaac T. Soon. Isaac T. Soon, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here, Jared.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time. Before we get going, though, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm currently assistant professor of religious studies at Callin University. This is my last term here. Actually, I'm moving to the University of British Columbia in the fall. I'm an expert in particularly the New Testament, but also Paul. But I study embodiment and disability and gender and its various conceptions and configurations in the ancient world across Jewish, early Christian, and those kinds of texts and materials.
And embodiment is, I know this won't come out along with the episodes that are coming out, but it's April, it's early April, and I've just come out with a series of episodes that are about materiality. And I think we'll just jump right into it. This is about your Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Little Messiah, Jesus as Te Hilikia Mikros in Luke 19:3. Please correct my pronunciation because
Oh, that was beautiful. That was
I'm
great.
not even done with my undergrad. And this is about embodiment, and it's a story that, as I was reading it, I was like, man, I remember learning this in Sunday school, and we thought we had this one locked. So I know there's a consensus around this. It's the Zacchaeus story.
Yeah.
And there's a pretty firm consensus. You really only list like 3 people who question it in the last century. What do we have wrong about the Zacchaeus story?
Whenever I tell the story to my students and I challenge it, there's undoubtedly always one student who stands up and starts quoting Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he, and that kind of dogma embedded in Sunday school. Yeah, the consensus, it's more than a consensus. It's just the absolute, New Testament interpreters are in total agreement that this passage in Luke 19:3, when Jesus encounters this chief tax collector named Zacchaeus, and the text describes him as short in stature, and universally interpreters say this is obviously Zacchaeus, can't be Jesus. And it's so much so the standard that when I was trying to get this piece through peer review, initially I'd submitted it to top New Testament journal, New Testament Studies, and the reviewer, when they got back to me, usually you get in peer review, you get couple paragraphs or these are things that could be improved or could have been better or some typos. The reviewer just left one sentence, which is Zacchaeus is the short one. And then that was it. There was no kind of argument. So it's firmly embedded and ingrained in the New Testament interpretation. But as you said, there have been a couple of naysayers over the last couple hundred years. And I've heard actually apocryphal stories from other academics when they were in seminary or in undergrad or divinity school, where they were taking a class looking at exegesis of Luke or a deep interpretation into its language and literature related to it. And they'd say some of their teachers did actually talk about the ambiguity of the text, that when it says he was short in stature, it could also apply to Jesus. And the audible gasps in the room. But then no one has explored or published on it since. So that's where I took the gap and published this article.
And they're pretty significantly divergent paths. There are some pretty serious implications for saying it's Jesus rather than Zacchaeus, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It challenges fundamentally the approach or assumptions that we as interpreters have about the text. And what's interesting about the consensus on this passage is that because it's just presumed, and no one really has many arguments against this position. The only interpreter that I engage with in the article that really has some substantial arguments that I deal with is Michael Parsons. And even then, it's only kind of in the footnotes. He doesn't argue. He takes it on good faith that we all know that this is about Zacchaeus, and then he examines Zacchaeus in wider physiognomic literature. Physiognomic literature in the ancient world is thinking about how moral or character values or flaws are virtues and vices are reflected in the physical makeup of people. So their bodies manifest their kind of character or moral value. And so Michael Parsons, in his great book on body and character in Luke and Acts, and a New Testament article from 2001, I think, on Zacchaeus, examines Zacchaeus from this point of view. But even then, he's one of the few interpreters that actually offers alternative or justification for this consensus. Otherwise, it's just passed down through New Testament scholarship as a kind of just a well-known.
One of the things that's popping into my head right now is the attempt by some commentators to link this to healing narratives. And that, as soon as I came across that in your article, I was like, that doesn't make sense. Like, one, being short is not a thing from which one needs to, or for which one needs to be healed. And two, if Zacchaeus is the short one, there's no resolution to that.
Yeah, exactly. My students grapple with this too because they're confused because people say they associate it with these other healing narratives in Luke, but Zacchaeus' body stays the same. It doesn't change at the end of the narrative, just as you said. The only kind of potential change, is the social change, where Zacchaeus, it can be interpreted that he's giving back money that he's taken away and he's repaying kind of reparations for coercive tax collection in the past. But there's no kind of physical alteration there. So it's a strange already. There's an implicit bias about his body and about the healing of bodies which seem to be divergent or different, the need to do that. But Zacchaeus doesn't fit that profile at all.
At one point, you mentioned that Zacchaeus is running. And I think I put something approximating this, but I'll just explain. I started thinking about this Kenneth Bailey book called Finding the Lost, and it's about Luke 15. And he talks about the father running out and that being a very socially humbling or humiliating. I'm not really even sure what the best word for it is, but it undermined his status. Is that a thing that we're seeing? And that kind of, I'm asking that because you mentioned the social aspect of this particular story.
Yeah, good question. I know Kenneth Bailey's work. I haven't studied or plumbed the turtles, the sources which Kenneth uses for the idea that running is unmasculine or improper at that time. Some of the hesitation I have with Bailey's work is that it draws on, I think, some kind of sometimes outdated anthropology or ethnography, like reading contemporary, firstly, like this kind of flattening or orientalization of Middle Eastern culture into this one kind of unchanging thing that if you study trends in the Middle East right now amongst different cultures, then you can retroject them back into the past. So I don't know where Bailey gets that from. Clearly, that doesn't seem to be a problem necessarily in Luke 19. Zacchaeus it's a very practical. He's just trying to get ahead of the crowd to get up to a higher place to see Jesus. But I think apart from the idea that it might be a shameful, whether it is or not, is not shameful for a man to run in the ancient world, in that context, I think the shared attitude between the father and the story of the prodigal son and Zacchaeus, I think there's some fruitful dialogue there, which is the willingness of the father just to receiving the son back, regardless of what all the offense and the waywardness. The attitude of the father is indicative there. I think with Zacchaeus running, it's less, like Parson argues, an indication that this is a part of his character, or people thought that people with short stature run very fast, and more about Zacchaeus's just how the extra length he's willing to go in order to see Jesus, just to catch a glimpse, right? And this is a hard attitude, which then becomes reflected later when he starts talking about giving away his money, right? He is so swift to give reparations, to repair anything that he might have damaged in the past. So I think it's less connected to his short stature, if we read him as short, and more connected to actually he behaves like an ideal apostle. He's really trying to connect with Jesus. He can't because of the crowd, and he's very swift to follow Jesus's instructions and follow this way. So he's presented as a kind of ideal disciple, I think.
And he's more pursuing forgiveness by trying to make up for what seems to have been an exploitative business operation on his part.
Sure. Yeah, I'm of two minds on this. I think it could be read that he has been exploitative the whole time, and upon meeting Jesus, he wants to change his ways and starts paying everything back. I do think the text can be a little bit ambiguous that it's something that he might have been doing this whole time. Again, challenging the kind of assumptions about tax collectors, because the crowd is so offended that Jesus has gone to this person's house, right? And it's so interesting that interpreters also reproduce that offense towards the tax collector, that if he's a tax collector, it must be because he's doing something wrong. But the Greek of the text is ambiguous. It could be talking about how he actually does give, if he accidentally defrauds someone, that he gives back more, repayments and things like that, especially on the back of Luke 18, where you have a tax collector who's behaving righteously, even in amidst the sin that they're supposedly doing.
So I remember talking to Jeremy O. Wright a while back, Jeremy O. Williams a while back. I'm going to leave that in just because I own my mistakes.
Me too.
About criminalization in Acts. And he does talk about Luke Acts as, granted, he emphasizes Acts more, but as a little bit friendlier to certain authority figures. Could that be the case with regard to tax collectors?
Oh, with Zacchaeus? Interesting. I guess the question for me, it's a potential. The question for me is whether Zacchaeus should be considered an authority figure. He's not an authority figure in the same way that scribes or teachers or chief priests or priests would be in that kind of religious way, or of course Pilate or Herod, because he's a worker that's outsourced by the Romans, right? He's collecting debts. He has to pay presumably up to the Romans as well. So I'm not sure necessarily whether he would be considered an authority in the same way as other figures in Luke. But it's a possibility. It would be an interesting research path to pursue, because I haven't seen anyone really pay attention to the positive or negative portrayals, or the positive portrayals of tax collectors in Luke.
I think maybe I'm wrong. I think I read something, Rebecca Runison, I'm probably saying it wrong. I think it may have been Centurions also, that there's a little bit more of an accepting, which the only reason I bring that up is because there is a kind of a revolutionary aspect here, like forgiveness and no longer attempting to defraud and no longer trying to take people's, or maybe he was never doing it and he's just highlighting it, so sorry, I ramble, but if the crowd is upset, he must not have been doing something above board, or just the association was a problem. Where do you follow there?
Yeah, I think I do agree that if the crowd's upset, they might be upset for good reason. But I think the crowd there behaves as an audience hearing the text would also respond, right? Like an audience who has no knowledge or personal knowledge of Zacchaeus will hear chief tax collector and that he's really rich, and automatically react with disgust, right? Because this is a person who defrauds their own, who's greedy, this embodiment of Greco-Roman vice. So yeah, it's potentially that he actually has defrauded in the past, and I think that's a legitimate reading. But I think it's also possible that they're assuming, because he's a tax collector, that he has got that way because of unethical practices. It's an interesting interplay, right? Because at least in some biblical texts, there's a kind of divine promise towards material financial blessing if you follow God's laws. It's not a guarantee, but figures who follow God's laws and are blessed in that way. But then when you get to stories in the Gospels, there's a critique of wealth to a certain extent because of people who are excessive and neglecting the poor and things like that. So I think audiences can be grappling with these two things, that God promises blessing in some of these texts to people if they follow his laws, but at the same time, there's a kind of exploitative nature and mammon nature in some of these gospel texts as well. I'm not too familiar myself with kind of the imperial critiques in the gospel literature, because I think sometimes they can be ambiguous. Like For example, the centurion in Mark's gospel at Jesus' side saying, truly, this is the Son of God. I've read arguments both ways. One, that this is someone who's affirming that this is actually God's son, or I think it's Mark Goodacre who wrote a piece way back when talking about how the centurion is being sarcastic, right? So these kind of anti-imperial critique or these subversive empire critiques, I'm a little bit more cautious about that because I'm not sure whether they're actually there.
Okay. And just for the listeners to understand, I'm following these other threads, these more social threads, because, and I'll read, I got to this part of the article and I got upset. So it's from Aristotle, and this is the English translation that's provided in your article. These are the marks of a little-minded man. He is small-limbed, small and round, dry, with small eyes and a small face, like a Corinthian or a Leucadian. And I read that and I was like, I'm pretty much done with this idea. Like, insofar as it matters that what my opinion of this is, but there's no benefit to saying he climbed up a tree because he was so small, because there's some pretty gross stuff like that just is underlying this idea that like the issue is that he's short, even though there's no resolution to that. Which there, I think your thesis makes sense because there doesn't need to be. The resolution is more in these social and economic and all these other categories that we have. That at the time it was just like Zacchaeus has a problem, and it's not that he's short; it's that he
Yeah,
needs to be integrated into the kingdom. I'm not really sure how you would characterize that.
yeah. I mean, he's recognized as a child of Abraham. Really, that's Jesus's language at the end in Luke 19:10. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the physical appearance just becomes a talking point for interpreters, right? The story doesn't necessarily contribute. Is not really focusing on that. It might just be a physical description. And you're right that in some of these physiognomic texts, like Pseudo Aristotle, there's ethnic stereotypes there, talking about Leucadian or Corinthians and things like that. Like these ethnic stereotyping based on physical features, and those physical features are attached to a particular character or vices or things like that. And it's possible that someone might have read that in the ancient world and thought, oh, maybe that tells us something about Zacchaeus, and it certainly resonates with that. And my other colleagues, like John Nelson, I think argue against me and say the physiognomic handbooks probably have a little bit more of a connection there. But at the same time, I think for us today, we're not bound by those ancient physiognomic ideas about short people or short people with short stature, right? Those kind of stereotypes. The text can be read in a multiplicity of different ways.
I think there is still an underlying idea of normalcy. And if the rebuttal is no, Jesus is normal and Zacchaeus is small, there is still this idea in people's minds that like the eschaton will bring a perfected version which is going to fit that understanding of normalcy, or maybe a slightly improved version of it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think I do agree that people are hesitant about the idea that I present in the article because they're uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus is not quote unquote normal or able-bodied or does not fit their kind of preconceived notion of he's the Son of God, incarnate man. If you come from that perspective, he must be perfect in that kind of physical way. It actually just exposes our own kind of able-bodiedness and ableism in interpreting these texts, that we assume that all these figures, including Jesus, but everyone is able-bodied, that there's no disability, that there's no kind of bodily difference there.
I think it may also, I don't know, I've been grappling with this. And today, I know it'll be out already for a while by the time this comes out. But today, the episode that dropped is conversation with Curtis Freeman. And it's about incarnation. And like I said, it's coming on the heels of a few of them. And materiality has become really important to me because I think for the last 25 years or so, I've been circling this idea that I think it seems to me like biblical authors were a lot more material minded than we give them credit for, and that spirituality and ideas of perfection that we have were imposed on biblical texts. And this is a good example because the idea that like, oh, Jesus was perfect in that he never did anything wrong, it really overly focuses on the idea of the moral individual. And I don't know how much that message resonates with what's actually in the New Testament text. And then the physical perfection, which, oh man, when you go down that road, it gets really gross. You start getting into Ubermensch territory and propaganda posters. And
Well, yeah, Jesus, all these scriptural figures. Actually, the next book I'm working on is I explore like different early Christian figures and how their bodies like are changed based on how people want to use them, and so their bodies like morph situation to situation. And the thing is, because these figures like Jesus are people of power, right? They're powerful images. They're powerful. They're connected to powerful ideas and communities and traditions. So if you control, I like to quote 1984 version of Dune, you control the spice. He who controls the spice, Dune controls the spice. He who controls the image or portrayal of Jesus controls the kind of the message and the theology and the ideas around this kind of figure. And so people are scared. If Jesus is a short person, if he's short statured, or if he has a body that's deviant from what we think is normal, then it makes a lot of systems and things uncomfortable. What do we do with the future? What does it mean to have that Jesus is perfect in this way? It's disruptive for us.
so I know you and I imagine we're roughly the same age, but so for my whole life, I guess disability accommodation has been an integrated idea. The fight against accommodating people with disabilities is largely over, and I need to be careful because I don't want to overstep my bounds there. Not being someone with disabilities, it seems people are not pushing back on that, but now it seems like disability activists, to my knowledge, are articulating, I don't know if it's integration or embrace or how to characterize that, but it is slightly different, and I think there's a different moral or ethical centerpiece there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of all the disabled activist community. I think there is, even though there's a lot more, for example, you've got the ADA and various laws and legislation that are there's still quite a lot of pushback for even accommodations, even post COVID, for example, right? Because of COVID and lockdown, a lot more people had access to ecclesial spaces, right? People attended church where they couldn't before because of physical access to things like that, or classrooms. And now, post COVID, what I see, at least in the sector which I work, which is education, is a skepticism from able bodied teachers and administrators about whether a lot of students are just faking accommodations or disabilities in order to get these extra things. So the pushback is less on a kind of public level and more kind of insidious that in institutional systems, skepticism amongst educators. My students say 25% of them say that they have autism. I don't think that's actually real. I think they're just saying that in order to get an advantage. What we are seeing though is because more and more people with disabilities have had access to education and services and accommodations now in disability history, in biblical studies, in theology, there's a lot more people who have been trained and who have voices and who are able to share their expertise and their experience at a more public level. So I think that's the beneficial aspect is it's a lot more present. But I'm cautious to say that I think that because there's more accommodations that there's been less pushback. I feel like that there's been more and more pushback because traditionally people with disabilities don't really often get a place at the table. We've had law in North America, at least. We've had a lot of discussions about racism, gender, sexuality, but disability intersects with all of those, and people with disabilities are often excluded or left out of the conversation as a whole. And so I think there's still a lot more work to be done, and I'm grateful for the accommodations that have been put in the past, but yeah, I think there can always be more.
Yeah, I think on the autism front, I think people think it's a lot squishier of a thing than it is. It's in the DSM. There are diagnostic, and I'm not arguing with you about that. That's just that one
Mhm,
gets my that one gets my dander up. But that's fair to say, and I think it probably followed a similar trajectory to something like anti-racism or civil rights
yeah.
activism, where it is direct and it is obvious and aggressive in the opposition at first, and then it becomes coded differently, and that's where things like dog whistles come in. People don't want to speak
Mm,
directly to the issue. So, because our
right.
time is running short, I do want to make sure I get this question. So, I remember talking to Nick Elder about his book, Gospel Media, and very early on, he says, something to the effect of this thing that's still pervasive, this belief, this view in biblical studies of, and I think it was just like people didn't read individually. I think that was the one that was
Yeah, yeah,
pretty much immediately abandoned in classics. And
yeah.
so I wonder the understanding of some of the text that you use to evaluate these assertions about Zacchaeus, the physiognomic literature, the BOA, is the consensus on those approaches shared by classicists, or does it differ from biblical studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. What a lot of my work in the article draws on classicists and their work on BOA and physical description. So I think from a classicist point of view, they would read my argument here and say that it's perfectly plausible because classicists don't necessarily have a predisposition to defend or maintain Jesus's body as able-bodied or normal, quote unquote. So I think based on the evidence, it's very plausible from a classical point of view. It becomes a problem for New Testament interpreters who are embedded in particular ways of doing scholarship that kind of prevent them from thinking a little bit more critically about assumptions brought to the text. So, for example, when I looked at for this article, people say there's no physical descriptions of Luke in there's no physical descriptions of Jesus in Luke in the same way that we see in ancient biography. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. I'll go back my classic ad fontes, go back to the texts, right? And then I realized in classics scholarship they had been distinguishing between different types of physical descriptions in different types of bioi, right? So there's Suetonian physical description, which is very robust. It's at the very beginning of the work. It's very dense and long and prolonged. Whereas in other parts of bioi, it could just be two words, and then it's not something significant. And so I think the issues in New Testament scholarship sometimes is that we've got a lot of other texts that engage with classicists, Jewish studies, rabbinics, Old Testament, all those type of things. So the tendency in a research approach can be just to take on. Someone has said somewhere that Luke's Luke has no physical descriptions like other bioi, but then when you actually go back to the texts and look in classic scholarship, for example, then you realize, oh, actually, it's a lot more of a nuanced conversation. So that's where a lot of my work in general is actually consulting with classicists and rabbinicists and ancient Jewish study scholars and looking at how they look at the texts and then bringing it into conversation with New Testament, because the divides between the fields have become so great now that, especially with engagement with primary sources, a lot of things are just being assumed at a kind of rhetorical level without actual more comprehensive engagement with the ancient sources.
I think the nuance and the adding layers and that kind of thing, that's the most exciting part about covering so many articles for this podcast. Is like it's not exclusively an academics podcast, but most of the people I talk to are. And being a slow reader, I appreciate that I can get exposed to an idea in 20 pages that someone else is going to come across this and think, that's interesting. I'm going to do a little bit more of the legwork to maybe flesh this argument out or add it onto a thesis that I already had.
Yeah,
And I've started noticing in the books that I do more and more articles from journals and things like that. I didn't really pay attention in the past to that kind
yeah,
of thing, but I noticed those things get my attention a little bit more. And they don't usually have like a lengthy footnote. It's just like Soon said back in 2023 or whenever I forget what year this article came out. So because I want to make sure I get recommendations before we close out here, where would you send people to learn more about this topic or any other topic that you deal with that you think is interesting?
yeah. There's a lot of great work being done on disability and bodies in New Testament. So the work of my colleagues Candida Moss, Emma Swy is there's she's got a great article coming out in an edited collection on disability studies. John Nelson has just finished his PhD working with Helen Bond in Edinburgh, looking at this particular issue across the Gospels, so physical descriptions of Jesus. So look forward to his book coming out. Yeah, there's just so many things to recommend. Anna Rebecca Solofog's book on a disability in early Christianity. Louise Gosbell's book on the poor, the blind, and the lame, I think, in Luke. That's a great text. My colleague Megan Henning, she's worked on education and Hell in Matthew, but her second book, Hell Hath No Fury, with Yale. A really great book that combines gender studies and disability studies to look at the way early Christians used kind of walkthroughs or tours of hell and what they did to bodies there as educational or tools for paideia. Yeah. Anything in the footnotes of my article. I especially appreciate the work of Brittany Wilson, her work on masculinity in Luke and Acts. Lots of great scholars who work on gender in the New Testament. And I think especially a lot of these women scholars who are bringing in perspectives that have been neglected in the field, because just since for the last 200 years, the majority of scholars have been men, mostly European men. And not that it's bad to be a man or from European descent, but it's
We
just,
can't help it.
yeah, yeah, but it's just, as I tell my students, it's just like one perspective, and it's not that it's a bad perspective, but it's just there are so many others, and the texts come alive when we're all participating in a community together. We're certainly going to disagree, but I think that the kind of camaraderie and community that comes out of reading texts in different ways, even opposing ways, is really well worth it.
Okay, this is my favorite question. What do you read
Yeah.
for fun?
That's a tough question. I have the unique privilege of being employed in an area that is also my hobby. I read academic things for fun. And before someone yells workaholism, it's purely because the overlap between my hobby and my work is just there. So what do I read for fun? Ancient texts, books, journal articles, poetry. Sometimes I subscribe to a couple of different poetry sites that kind of put some nice poems in my inbox every day. Currently making my way through this great edited volume by Megan Heading and Niels Neumann, Vivid Rhetoric and Visual Persuasion, Ekphrasis in Early Christian Literature. This is actually awesome. Ekphrasis is like detailed textual descriptions of things that are going on. It has its roots in the classical tradition, and so lots of really great stuff there. I love visual work. I got a book from Timothy Brookins, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians. I'm almost certain I'm going to disagree with his argument here, but I think I'm really excited to learn about how he approaches Paul and Stoicism in the Corinthian letters. Currently reading and rereading Candida Moss's God's Ghostwriters. I've been waiting for that book to come out for 4 years. Most of
It
my
sounds
work
interesting.
most of my work is a footnote to Candida's work. Her scholarship has just been really great. But most of the time, I read academic things for fun. That's what I do. That's where I get energized and feel alive.
What are some of those poetry sites?
The one that I get every day is the Paris Review Poetry. Really great poems, actually. And there's another one. Oh, actually, I should plug. There is two of my favorite disabled poets. One is Ilya Kaminsky. He has a really beautiful set of poems called Deaf Republic. He's a Ukrainian poet, and he talks about Ukrainian life, but also disabled Ukrainian life. And his poem, We Lived Happily During the War, is one of the most haunting pieces about living away from the war in Europe in luxury that we do. Another one, this is such a tremendous set of poetry, and is by Jerome Ellis, Aster of Ceremonies. Jerome is also a Black disabled poet, but just he has a speech disability and translates it into his poetry. And there's some really great overlaps for religious studies and interpretation of the Bible and things like that. And he combines it with hymnody. So there's like hymns in here and music. Yeah, really beautiful stuff.
When do you sleep, man?
I have 3 kids. So I have 3 daughters. So I've had to learn to do a lot in a short amount of time, because when you're an undergrad, you stay up till, at least if you're like a young undergrad, you can stay up till 4 a.m. and submit that paper. I don't have that luxury. You have 30 minutes before school pickup or feeding the bottle or whatever, nap time. You got 45 minutes and you just have to do it. So that actually, I flourished under that when I was doing my PhD and working. Yeah, I love television, I love movies, and I've consumed a lot of that. Just doesn't have the same kind of joy or, I guess, mental energy that when I read things and think about ideas. And I'm always working on 4 or 6 projects on the go, so gotta keep reading.
Well, I won't take up any more of your time. Isaac Soon, I really appreciate you being here, man. Take care.
Jared, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation.
Hey, it's Jared again. I realized a couple of weeks ago while I was cutting the grass that it would probably be cool, since I plan ahead, for me to start throwing in a little teaser here at the end of the episodes so that you know what's coming up on the next episode. The plan here is the episode that comes out for free next week has already been released on Patreon. So I'm doing double duty. I'm informing the audience, letting you all know what will be released next week, but I'm also giving you the opportunity to know, hey, for $5 a month, you can go over to Patreon and you could get these things a week ahead of schedule. So next week's episode will be my interview with Nick Posgay. So here's a little teaser of that interview. Thanks for listening.
So those things qualify for storage in a Geniza, but the contents of them could just be a love letter. We have letters from husbands and wives who are no longer living together because the husband usually has gone off on business, and that takes a year or more to travel to India and buy goods and then travel all the way back to Cairo. So they'll send letters back and forth, and they're talking about each other or their families, but they're not talking about anything particularly sacred. And yet this is stored in the Cairo Geniza. And for 1,000 years, it was never emptied out. So we have shopping lists and kids writing exercises from their schoolwork and recipe books and all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect to find, at least in a modern Geniza, which we mainly expect to find Bibles, prayer texts, things like that. Those are also in the Cairo Geniza, but it's the whole range of genres that the Jews of Cairo had access to in the medieval period.